Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Christensen, and I'm FERC's General Counsel. This is the time and place that has been noticed for the 5th meeting of the Joint Federal State Task Force on Electric Transmission to consider the matters that have been posted in the agenda issued on November 2nd, 2022, and docket AD 2115. This meeting is on the record, and a transcript will be placed into the docket. Public can listen and observe in the room and online. Any comments by the public can be submitted into the docket through FERC's e-filing system. Please visit FERC's website for more detail. Today's discussion will avoid the merits of any pending contested matter, and I will interrupt discussions if we enter that territory. Task force members can address matters raised in pending proceedings generally, but should not speak to the specific merits of a pending contested matter. With that, I'll turn it over to the task force co-chairs, FERC Chairman Rich Glick and Maryland Public Service Commission Chair Jason Stanek. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and welcome to everybody. This is actually, it's very interesting. This is our 4th task force meeting. It's actually 1 year ago today we had our first one, and it's amazing. We've only covered the kind of the boring subjects of cost allocation and planning and participant funding and things like that. But now we get into the meat of things. But before we get started, I wanted a couple of things. Wanted to welcome Commissioner Houck and Chair Pridemore and Chair Stanek. We'll have more to say about them. But thank you very much for agreeing to serve on this commission, or I should say task force, and commission's task force. They're all the same, right? But also I wanted to take a second to thank Chair Thomas, who I know is out there in the audience. As everyone knows, since our last meeting, Chair Thomas left the Arkansas Public Service Commission. I want to thank him for his service, but more importantly, thank him for his participation on this task force. He was a very much of a significant contributor, very deep thinker, as everyone knows, and really provided a lot of very helpful input for us at FERC, and also for, I think, for the state commissioners as well. So thank you very much, Chair Thomas. We can clap for him. Good. Moving on to today's subject, which is transmission cost oversight, and I'll speak very quickly. I know we don't have an enormous amount of time, but really wanted to mention that, first of all, we had FERC had a technical conference on this issue about a month and a half ago or so, and it was maybe even more recently than that, but it was very illuminating, and I think a lot came out of that meeting. But I think it's pretty clear, as we've talked about over the last several meetings, there's recording in progress. That's okay. We can keep on going. But there's going to be a significant amount of transmission built in the future, and a lot of it's going to be costly, expensive transmission. So we need to make sure consumers get the best bang for their buck. And as FERC commissioners and as state commissioners, that's our responsibility, to make sure that the money that utilities and others spend are spent wisely. Essentially, customers' money is spent wisely. And at the technical conference I mentioned that we had recently, there were a number of very interesting things that came up, and we had really good participation from state regulators, consumer advocates, utilities, transmission planners, and others. And what really stuck out to me, there were a lot of things that came to light during the meeting, but really stuck out to me was that there was some real concern about regulatory gaps, whether they be at the state level, with the federal level, with regard to certain types of transmission, at least. And I think that's some of the things I think we need to take a look at today and talk about. And I think we're going to have a good, vibrant discussion about that. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to Chair Stanek for his opening comments, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been a year, and in this past year, we've had 4 meetings, as the chairman just said. Today is the 5th meeting. And since that time, these commissioners around the table, particularly working with the state commissioners, have done a remarkable amount of work drilling down into some of these large issues that FERC has teed up in its recent papers. The transmission task force members have continued to engage with various stakeholders, including the TOs, the RTOs. Just yesterday, a number of us met with our counterparts at the state ratepayer associations. And we've been doing this to ensure that customers continue to receive reliable service, just and reasonable rates. This topic does deviate somewhat from the first 4 transmission meetings, where we tackled and addressed some of the larger general topics. And even I would wager that even if all those issues of cost allocation and generator interconnection reform were resolved, the issues that we're here to address today will still remain. Filling these regulatory gaps, determining whether a gap exists between FERC and the states. Would additional planning fill that gap? Or do we need statutory or regulatory changes? So I'm looking forward to having a broader discussion beyond what the 10 of us watched on the October 6th technical conference, and using that to continue the dialogue that we've engaged in so productively over the past 12 months. As the chairman just noted, we've had some change in the membership composition since our last meeting in San Diego. On behalf of the state commissioners, I'd also like to recognize the contributions of Ted Thomas. I know we all miss him greatly. He's provided, he was our sort of our intellectual rock of Gibraltar for the N10 team. So we do miss him. As the chairman mentioned, we do have two new members. Cliff Rakesheffin from California was replaced by Darcy Hauk. And of course, Ted was replaced by Chair Pridemore of Georgia. And I'd like to turn it over to them for some brief remarks, beginning with Commissioner Hauk.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay, you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you again. Yes, my name is Darcy Hauk. I'm a commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission. And I'm very happy to be here. I was appointed by Governor Newsom in February of 2021. Prior to being appointed, I was the general counsel for the California Energy Commission. With Cliff's term ending at the end of the year, I stepped in to take this role, and I believe transmission is one of the most important issues we're going to be dealing with during my time at the commission. And I'm both honored and humbled to be a part of this group and look forward to participating on the task force.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair Pridemore.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tricia Pridemore. I am proud to serve the entire state of Georgia as an elected commissioner and also elected to serve as chair. It's an honor to be a part of this task force group. We are in the middle of a major year at the Georgia Commission with not only a comprehensive IRP, but also a rate case for our single and large investor-owned utility. Transmission is the conversation. And so I look forward to serving with you all and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you to our new members. And thank you, Dr. Rob, for facilitating yet another meeting for us.
Thank you and welcome everybody. Hopefully everybody in the back can hear, and I know there's a screen there. We're looking forward to another productive task force meeting. As you know, from reading the NOPRs, the discussions that we've had in the task force meetings have helped to influence, shape the NOPRs, and even to the point where some of the task force members have been directly quoted in the NOPRs. So we're looking forward to another productive meeting. Just to remind folks, this is a task force, and so it's a place for really give and take and interactive back and forth. In part, it's a sounding board for FERC as it's thinking through these issues, but it's also more than that because the states are taking actions on these issues. So it's really a back and forth forum. Also, as we're discussing things, if task force members are uncomfortable with a particular proposal or direction that it seems like a lot of the task force members seem to be heading down, I think it's really important that you voice some of your concerns and maybe offer an alternative. We saw that at the last meeting. It's helpful if things are voiced and other task force members can address those concerns to some degree, but at least have some back and forth. The other thing is I just want to remind the state task force members that we have 2 task force members from each region in the country. First and foremost, you're representing the region, but we also want you to be able to talk about the perspective from your own state or your own personal view. It's just when you're doing the latter, if you could just clarify that you're putting your own state or personal hat on, that would be helpful. Otherwise, we're assuming you're kind of bringing the regional perspective into the conversations. Just 2 small run of show things, and then I want to go over the agenda. One is if everybody could make sure when you're speaking that the mic is close to you so that everybody can hear, in particular that I can hear. And the second is for our new task force members, we're using the old fashioned put the tent card up if you want to be in the queue, and I'll keep track of that. But what do we have in store for us today? We've got this is our shortest task force meeting, and so we're going to be really moving pretty quickly through a number of things. And the way that we have it today structured is we'll start with a conversation about what are the gaps and the challenges, and then we'll move into what are some of the potential solutions. And when we move into some of the potential solutions, we're going to be focusing on two things and then other thing buckets. So we're going to be talking specifically about what is the role that an independent transmission monitor could potentially play. And then the second issue that we'll talk about is FERC formula rates or prudence review framework reforms. And then lastly, we'll have an other category where we'll talk about a few other things. And the way that we'll do this, just particularly for the audience sake, is we'll have on every topic or group of questions, we'll have some opening remarks from one or two FERC commissioners, one or two state commissioners that are kind of pre-tasked with that, and then we'll open it up for discussion. We also do have detailed questions, which we've been working on. Again, there's a team of FERC staff and NTEM staff and myself. And so I'll be reading those questions because the task force members know them, but the audience doesn't, just before we launch into each one, if that's okay. So with that, any questions, particularly if you're the new task force members, before we launch? Okay. So we're into our first topic is what are the gaps and the challenges. We have 4 questions. We're going to discuss the first two first for a while, then move on to the third and the fourth. So I'll just read the first 2 questions and I'll let you know who's up, and we'll be going. So the first question is there sufficient state and or federal review of local transmission projects from a need and prudence perspective? And relatedly, is there sufficient state and or federal review of regional transmission projects from a need and a prudence perspective? And also a sub question there is how does this assessment differ in RTO versus non-RTO regions? Obviously, we could probably spend the whole day on that first question, but just we're adding another question into this first discussion, which is how significant is any lack of oversight and cost management associated with transmission facilities that are not included in any regional transmission planning process and do not fall within a regulatory review process, such as asset management facilities or low voltage local facilities that may be categorically or historically excluded from review. So those are the first 2 questions we're discussing, and we're going to first hear from Commissioner Phillips from FERC, then Chair Glick from FERC, and then Chair LeVar and Chair Dutrell. Take it away.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome today. You know, as a general matter, from what I've heard on this issue of prudence review, that something is lacking, that something is missing in this process. And so what I'd like to do is just take a moment and go through some of my notes from the technical conference, from what we heard from some of our witnesses, and then I'll point questions to particular state colleagues to get their response where I think appropriate. If that's okay with everybody, I'll just dive right in. At the tech conference, we heard a lot about the lack of transparency and the lack of opportunity for customer participation in the development of local planning criteria. For instance, even in the PJM's attachment M3 supplemental project process, which does provide some transparency. We heard that states still do not have enough information to replicate utility decisions. I think this is important because we know that the commission requires states to be able to replicate the results of planning studies. So I'm interested in hearing from my colleagues, Chair Stanek, Chair Brown-Dutrell, on whether or not they have any issues or they're familiar with any issues on that topic. As differences between RTO and non-RTO regions, there generally seems to be a more robust state level prudency review in non-RTO regions, especially in those states that have IRPs. But interesting, we did hear from one witness, Chair Chandler, and I have to say, I have been accused of being passionate about regulatory matters. I do not hold a candle to this man. He is passionate about this subject. And we heard at the conference that, transparency and information asymmetry problems are even or can be even worse in non-RTO regions. I mean, Chair Chandler, he stated that from his interesting perspective of a state that straddles multiple RTOs and has utilities that are in non-RTO regions, he said that PJM's attachment M3 process gives the Kentucky PSC far more insight into local planning for its PJM utilities than Kentucky has for its non-RTO utilities. This is where they don't even find out until a utility comes in for a CPCN or a rate case on what some of the issues might be. I'd love to hear from Commissioner Duffley, North Carolina, on whether or not she agrees, putting on my law professor hat, whether or not she agrees with Chair Chandler's assessment. And I'd also like to hear from my other colleagues, especially in the southern regions, and whether or not states play an important role in the CERTEP process and whether or not you think that they should. Moving on to regional projects briefly. With respect to regional reliability projects, we heard that local problems tend to leak into the regional process, since you have to have information in order to identify more cost-effective regional alternatives, and the regional projects are chosen based on local projects that they displace. In any event where you land on that issue, what's clear is that there have been no Order 1000 reliability regional projects that have ever been selected in a non-RTO region. So with that, I'll stop right there and turn it over to Chair Clay.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Phillips. And, I think that, to put it simply, that the questions are, number one, are there gaps, regulatory gaps associated with certain types of transmission projects? And if so, how significant are those gaps? And the answer that we all give to every single question is it depends, right? And it depends, in this case, I think, with regard to which region you're talking about. Are you talking about RTO versus non-RTO? What types of transmission facilities? For instance, it seems to me that and it seems based on the testimony we received during our technical conference, that there are, the big regionally planned projects go through a significant amount of review. And I think I've been talking to some state commissioners and so on, and there seems to be more comfort that those projects are sufficiently screened in terms of whether the right project, their cost effectiveness, and the benefits that they may provide customers. There's always disagreements on cost allocation, but I think in general, in terms of prudence and so on, I think those are generally considered to be a sufficient regulatory process. But there's another category of projects, mostly they're called different things in different regions, but the local transmission projects that, for a variety of reasons, don't necessarily have sufficient levels of review. Part of it may be that, well, we see that in certain regions of the country, the transmission owners come to FERC and say, well, don't worry, the states are taking care of it. And the states are saying, we thought you were taking care of it. And that's part of the problem, I think, in terms of some states have a really sufficient process of usually a public necessity and convenience process in terms of determining whether a proposed transmission line is sufficient and so on. Other states either don't have the regulatory authority, or there are certain types of projects they don't review under that process. And so then it comes back to FERC, and sometimes those projects are already decided on at the local level. They don't go through a rugged regional transmission process, and then they come to us. And they a lot of times those projects get put into formula rates, and there's really not much review formula rates. The burden is shifted, and that's a difficult situation. And so I think that we have to kind of divvy out, and hopefully we'll do that today, the types of projects we're talking about, and whether in fact the states have sufficient authority, and beyond that, whether the states and FERC have sufficient access to information. That's a big part of it. It's not easy sometimes to determine whether the decision is right, especially when there's a lack of transparency in the process. And so I'm hoping the discussion today will lead us to not only identifying the problems, but maybe some potential solutions to address the lack of transparency.
Thank you. Chair LeVar.
Thank you. I hope my microphone is working. My green light's broken, so I can't tell if it's working.
It's working.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to give a little perspective on the portions of the West that are not covered by the California ISO, so what I call the non-RTO portions of the West, and the level of state oversight, again, is similar to what Commissioner Phillips and Commissioner Glickert is saying for the federal oversight. It depends on the type of project. It depends on who's building it, determines the oversight structure, and individual state laws treat them differently. The question is focused on need and prudence, and to me, need and prudence really boils down to is the proposed project the least cost, least risk based on comparisons and modeling against other options. And to me, that also has to be modeling against both generation and transmission options. I don't think you can separate the two, and to really get a need and prudence evaluation, those have to be considered together because they're interdependent and interrelated. But the type of state level review that happens, it depends on also what stage of the process. There's different state review at the planning process, the CPCN process, and cost allocation. At the planning process, outside of the ISO, we have entities, 2 Order 1000 planning entities, Northern Grid and West Connect. Those are basically heavily informed by individual utility integrated resource plans. And state regulators have a significant role in reviewing those plans. We all have different state statutes, and our reviews take different forms in each of the states. But we all have a responsibility to ensure that those plans are modeling adequate options and are fully modeling all the different potential generation and transmission options to find those least cost, least risk outcomes. Now, when those IRPs are utilized in the transmission planning process, the utility regulators, the state regulators become stakeholders, not decision makers in that planning. But we are informed by the individual IRP review processes that occur in our states. On the planning process, the one consistent piece of feedback that I've heard, and that has also been heard by WEC, the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, is currently doing a study where they're reaching out to a lot of stakeholders on these processes. And there is a pretty consistent theme feedback that's coming back in a desire for more independence in those transmission planning organizations. Now, what form that takes, people have many more different opinions. Some stakeholders believe that an RTO is the answer to greater independence in the planning. Others think that there might be different paths, but there is a pretty consistent theme that a lot of stakeholders would like to see more transparency. That doesn't necessarily mean more state oversight on need and prudence, but something to increase, sorry, not transparency, independence, to increase the independence of those processes. One concern that has been communicated in connection with that is consensus projects aren't always necessarily the least cost, least risk. And we want to make sure that the processes aren't just aiming for a consensus, but full modeling that identifies least cost and least risk. Now, the states have a different role when it gets to either cost allocation or CPCN. And again, it depends on who's building the line, basically, in the non-RTO regions of the West, what form that takes and whether there is one. Some lines are being built by vertically integrated utilities, and there's a pretty high level of state review. There's other lines being built by merchant generators where their cost recovery comes primarily through bilateral contracts. And so there's not the same kind of state review of that. For those that are built by the vertically integrated utilities, though, the state review of need and prudence can occur either in the CPCN, which again varies by state. In some states, it's a siting issue. In Utah, it's more of a need and prudence issue. It's not a siting issue in Utah. But a lot of states in the West also, when they're vertically integrated utilities are building a project that comes out of this, have to go through a state regulated request for proposals process that also adds in additional modeling and consideration of options. And this review is pretty robust and requires, in most of the states in the West, it requires review by the regulators, both when the utility issues the RFP to make sure it's broad enough to consider multiple options and that it has adequate review of those options. One thing that some states in the West have in this process is an independent evaluator who, in the states that have them, they're hired by the commission. They are paid for by the utility, but they report to the commission and advise the commission on reviewing this process. And I'm not here today to advocate on the independent transmission monitor issue that I know is going to be a significant topic of discussion, but I do want to say that in the states in the West, and Utah is one of them, that utilize this independent evaluator in at least an analogous situation, I can unequivocally say it adds significant value to those processes. And it really gives us a lot more confidence that all options are being considered and that the process is transparent, fair, and has the right kind of input. Obviously, merchant lines that are recovering their costs through bilateral contracts don't receive that same level of state review. And I think that's all I have to add at this point. Thanks.
Thank you. Chair Patel.
Morning, is this on? Yes, I think so. Good morning, everyone. I want to make sure I don't repeat in terms of other things that we've heard, but I want to focus a little bit more on some things that we see in Pennsylvania, but generally just start out in terms of the formula rate proceedings that we see. And when we're looking at it, we know that the initial review is very substantive. A lot of stakeholders are part of the process and discussing things. But the subsequent review, the annual review subsequently, are more things where we feel that we could have more review of, or not we per se, but there could be more substantive review of it. I don't know that I have an answer for it, so I'll just tell you that up front. And I know that it's something that you've already heard before as well. All of our transmission owners in Pennsylvania have gone through initial process, except for one, and they have their filing up. But so we know that initial process is more substantive. So we're looking to see if maybe there could be more of an increase in terms of the review in the subsequent annual filings. When we look at the state filings in terms of transmission, we in our region, most of us are restructured states, if not all of us, and most of us are in PJM except for New York, which has their own ISO. So when we're not looking at it from the non-RTO areas, as Commissioner LeVar was referring to, but more of what we are doing individually within our state, within our RTO. Pennsylvania, I don't think that we're unique, but I will talk about Pennsylvania specifically in terms of our review of the local projects, supplemental projects, and things of that nature. And there's a difference. We break it up into 3 categories. So the smaller ones, the 35 kV to 100 kV, the utilities just usually file a report with our staff. Plain and simple. And I know you guys have heard that before in your technical conference. Then the other projects, when we're talking about the 101 kV and above, where they're just rebuilding. You know, once again, that's more of an abbreviated process. We call it our LON, or letter of notice process. And generally those are not adjudicated because they're just rebuilding, and there's different factors that we look and consider that as well. It's the bigger projects, the 101 kV and above, that where you need new siting. That's where we put our focus in terms of the full application siting process, and they need to come in for a certificate of public convenience. We just call ours the CPC. We don't add the N on there, but it is in there in terms of the definition. I don't want you to think that that's not considered. So when we're looking at that, we do have that full siting review. It's very significant. We have our own evaluation in terms of that. We develop a complete and comprehensive record, and we're willing to challenge the assumptions in the regional and local planning process. So, we think with that and the expert testimony that is part of these contested cases, we have sufficient review in terms of that. However, many of the filings that are before us in terms of local planning are in that sub 100 kV. So as I talked to you before in terms of the first two, so you can see that there's less of a review. The 35 to 100 kV, we're talking about filing something with staff. The 101 and above, where there's no new siting, once again, it's an abbreviated process. So we're seeing more and more of those type of projects coming before us instead of the more significant projects where you would need more siting. And, I don't want to argue which one is better or whatever, but with that, there's less of a review. I don't know if you could probably argue maybe it's our fault in terms of how we break it down. That's in our regulations, and maybe we need a review of our regulations and some changes made there. But I'm just being very open and obvious with what we're seeing over the last several years, where there's a big increase in these type of projects. So we're looking at that. We're looking at what our technical staff, the ability that they have in terms of reviewing all of this. And I don't want to get in trouble with Commissioner Christie too. I don't want to say, do the blame game or whatever in that sense. But I know as all states, and even with FERC as well, you're looking at balancing your needs in terms of staff and what staff can do. We in Pennsylvania, as you probably all are doing, we have staff that are, doing different things. So they may not be focusing solely on transmission projects, but they may be doing some other things. And that helps us to be more efficient as an agency and be able to use the talent that we have and expand their talent as well. So when we look at all that and we see the increase coming, those are our challenges that we need to address. But in addressing them, we may have some different things, and I'm sure it will come later in the discussions today.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for getting us started with your thoughtful remarks. I'm going to take maybe just a couple of comments because we're actually behind schedule already in terms of the subtimes of our ambitious agenda. But let's take a couple of comments and then everybody can just layer things in as we go. Chair Stanek.
Well, just quickly, excuse me, in response to Commissioner Phillips, as you just heard from Chair Brown-Dutrell, every state has a different CPCN process. Maryland's are very robust. That's not the same in every state. PJM has a very comprehensive RTEP process for the reliability projects, for the market efficiency projects. But when you look at the local projects, and every RTO calls them differently, supplemental, sub-regional projects, there is a less thorough review. There's no opportunity for discovery. I have to say in PJM, the M3 attachment process does provide a fair amount of insight, as Chair Chandler recognized, but it's not the same degree of thoroughness. I think one comment that our colleague from Maine mentioned at the conference was that the state commissions get involved in the middle. They're not involved in the planning. The TO arrives at the state commission asking for the CPCN. Presumably it's granted, and then they go about their way, and the cost is handled through FERC rates, whether formula rates or stated rates. And so we're just sort of like the pit stop in between as the project gets developed. And that process may not be sustainable for the long term, because in PJM currently, these supplemental projects currently represent the majority of all projects. So the exception may very well be swallowing the rule.
Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you. I also wanted to respond to Commissioner Phillips. And so whether I agree with Kent Chandler or not, I don't know if I'll answer that question sufficiently, because I'm not sure what the regulatory construct is in Kentucky and what the authority of the Kentucky Commission is over their regulated utilities. However, what I can say from a North Carolina perspective, I can answer that. we have the authority to bring in, open an investigation, bring in our regulated utilities if we feel we're not receiving the information that we need. And so the North Carolina Utilities Commission has that authority. And you've heard at the technical conference, public staff of the North Carolina Utilities Commission, which represents the using and consuming public, because of the changing drivers of transmission, feel like they need some more information and some more assistance. And so they issued an RFQ and they have hired a consultant to help them with the local transmission planning process, the regional transmission planning process, as well as the state level cases. We, as you all may know, we have the carbon plan. I can't talk about the carbon plan because it's an open docket, but I think I can say that they need assistance there as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Comment from Commissioner Houck, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that and follow up from other commissioner comments that in Cal ISO, the asset management and replacement projects that do not expand capacity of the grid are not reviewed specifically by FERC, Cal ISO, or the CPUC. And this has been a significant problem because nearly 2/3 of the transmission spending in Cal ISO is on these projects, these repair and replacement projects. So over the last 3 years, 63% of the transmission investment by the 3 largest transmission owners in the Cal ISO has been on these, what we refer to in California as self-approved projects. And they are not reviewed by Cal ISO as part of the local and regional transmission planning. And just to give you an example of the magnitude of the spending, PG&E, or Pacific Gas and Electric Company, the largest transmission owner in Cal ISO, they have proposed for the 2022 to 2027 for their jurisdictional transmission capital expenditures, roughly $13.1 billion, and $11 billion, or 84% of these expenditures by PG&E during this period will be self-approved projects that have not gone through Cal ISO's transmission planning process.
Great, thank you, everybody. So the next question builds on this, which is if a state regulator has limited authority such as CPCN, Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, integrated resource planning, or a non-transmission alternative process, and federal review is limited or non-existent, is additional oversight needed? And if so, which entity should provide added oversight? FERC, states, and what additional oversight is needed? And we're going to kick this off with Commissioner Allen, then Chair Scripps, and followed by Commissioner Christie from FERC.
Thank you. So I'm not going to respond to this question exactly as it's framed, because I think that it's not just an issue of whether the state regulator has the authority. I think it's really more a question of how robust is that authority exercise. I know we've had references to kind of the variability in the CPCN processes. I think the planning frame is very important. I know, as an example, in my state, we have IRP process, but the IRP processes are processes that apply to the distribution utilities. It doesn't apply to our transmission company. And so the existence of the IRP process in our state isn't the relevant factor. That said, we actually have very robust transmission planning in our state, and we have a very robust transmission planning stakeholder process, and that process is actually state or commission sanctioned, so that it has appointments on it from the commission. And it's at least in my mind, it's exactly the kind of framework that leads to a more robust CPCN process. That is the certification, the pit stop that Chair Stanek referred to earlier, is made all the more robust by the fact that we do have that planning process in place. So it's a framework that I think, ideally should be replicated in other instances, but I just wanted to call that out. It's what I would say is that it's not the authority of the state through an IRP or the CPCN process or consideration of non-transmission alternatives or non-wires alternatives or grid enhancing technologies, but it's really the process that leads to that pit stop along the way. The other part of what gives me comfort, at least in my state, is the fact that we have, I think, a fairly robust planning process at the regional level. It gives me confidence that the state processes that are taking place are feeding into, and there is a forum through the Planning Advisory Commission process at the regional level to engage and test the projects at the state level, at the state planning level in a more robust forum. I do think that the ISO does look at costs. I think there are questions about whether that is adequately robust or not. I think that can be enhanced through some of the things that we'll be talking about in the next segment, so I won't get into those things. In short, I'll just say that I think there is an opportunity for kind of enhancements of the review of really projects by FERC, capital intensive projects, especially capital intensive projects that are essentially being self-authorized or self-approved, and those that are essentially flagged through the process, through robust processes. But I would say that the focus isn't needed in the areas where essentially the elements that I would flag, which are kind of a robust planning process before the CPCN process, an opportunity for stakeholders to engage in CPCN process, a robust kind of regional review. And I would add one other element, which is some mechanisms for cost containment once the project starts to be implemented. So that's a cost sharing mechanism or some sort of a variance review process that might follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Scripps.
Thank you. I'll start by saying that I agree with Chair Stanek and Commissioner Houck that the sort of rise in these locally planned projects is an issue in the Midwest as well, coming from the MARC region, that we call them other projects. I think it's supplemental in the part of Michigan that's in PJM, but we're seeing the same trends, and I think that's probably what's driving today's conversation. I think unlike the Utah experience that Chair LeVar talked about, in the states in the Mid-American part of the country, our role is largely on siting, not on need and prudence. We have largely, and this differs by state, and I think this is going to be a theme throughout, the different states, whether it's as Chair Brown-Dutrell talked about, different sort of voltage thresholds or line length thresholds where we get involved even on the siting piece, but it's typically not a need and prudence. There are a couple of states, Minnesota and Mississippi. I know Mississippi's not in the Midwest, but they are in MISO, that require the filing of transmission plans. And I know in Mississippi or in Minnesota, sorry, they take that a step further and actually have a transmission day each year where they go through these plans in a public forum and sort of add a degree of transparency to them, which I think can be helpful. The Michigan experience is that we have independent transmission in Michigan under statute. And so while I think there are a number of utilities that optimize for transmission and generation and to some extent distribution as well, internally, I like to say we have our fights in public on this, but I think that can be helpful as well. And the sub-regional planning process involving projects in Zone 7 in MISO, which is Lower Michigan, tends to be the most robust of those processes, I think, because there are different business interests that show up, and it leads to a more robust discussion. In terms of the sort of IRP context and how transmission gets considered there, it also varies. And indeed, the IRP context or the requirements varies.
when you just look at the 4 states that surround Lake Michigan, for example, Wisconsin does not have an IRP process, nor does Illinois. And there's differences in sort of how those 2 states are structured from an electricity standpoint. Indiana does have an IRP process. It's a contested case, but ultimately those IRPs are not formally approved by the commission in Indiana, and Indiana is vertically integrated. And in Michigan, we do have an IRP process with an opportunity for the commission to either approve, reject, or recommend changes, which then goes to an approve or reject of the IRP. And transmission in the Michigan context is required as an IRP filing element. But I will tell you that this works better, I think, in theory than it has in practice in the first couple of rounds of IRPs, where it's been a challenge for the utilities, which again are not, with the exception of Indiana, Michigan, are not transmission owners, and the small part of Excel in the Western Upper Peninsula. I always forget that, and I'm always reminded. They're not typically transmission owners for the large part. And so it's been a challenge to sort of fully address transmission issues in the IRP context. And I'd say on the flip side, there are challenges, particularly with timing in considering non-transmission alternatives as part of the MISO process, at least. And so those, I think, are exacerbated both by jurisdictional and in some cases business issues as well. And I will also say on the non-transmission alternatives piece, I know this isn't an interconnection discussion. We've already had that one, but that plays into this as well, that if you've got to get into a queue position 3 years in advance in order for your non-transmission alternative to be considered as part of the transmission planning process, it just obviously exacerbates those challenges. So a comprehensive approach, I think, is warranted. And then finally, in terms of the question of who should provide oversight here, I think it's the right question, but candidly, I'm not sure of the answer. And so I hope that over the course of today and indeed beyond, we can continue to get into this. My sense, though, is that it requires both FERC and sort of through FERC jurisdictional entities like the RTOs, as well as the states. I know that NARUC and NASIO had a task force on comprehensive electricity planning, trying to address some of these things, how to better integrate transmission planning, generation planning, and distribution planning. I think there were some valuable lessons learned from the 15 states, including Michigan, that participated in that. But it's a problem that we haven't yet fully solved. And so I think there's more work to do here.
We know what that noise is? Okay. Commissioner Christie, you discussed this quite a bit at the technical session, so.
Okay, let's put this in context and talk about what's really at stake here. Last year, national transmission rate base went up over 9%. That's the 3rd consecutive year it's gone up over 9%. What goes into rate base goes into consumers' bills, every nickel. And in the last decade, national transmission rate base is almost tripled. And my math genius here, Neil, told me that at 9%, it's going to double again in the next 8 years. This is all going into customers' bills. So this is a hugely important issue. This is a ton of money. This is big, big money. So we have to be talking about what level of scrutiny. And I'm not implying that any of those projects weren't justified. The question in front of us is, what is the process by which they get reviewed? At the technical conference on October 6th, which was a great conference, give Commissioner Clements credit for it. She pushed for it. It's a great idea. We heard a lot of testimony from different states. Some states are doing a robust review. Maryland does, Pennsylvania does, Virginia does. But we also heard many states have virtually no review. Certainly not of local projects, maybe regional, but certainly not local projects. So some are getting scrutinized at the state levels. Some are not getting any scrutiny at the state level. FERC cannot tell the states how to structure their review processes. But what FERC can do is FERC decides which projects get formula rate treatment. And let's stipulate that any rational transmission owner wants FERC's formula rate treatment compared to a fully litigated rate case. I think we can stipulate to that. So FERC decides who gets formula rate treatment. And one idea is FERC says, if you want formula rate treatment, you have to have undergone a credible state review. And we'll let the states tell us whether it was credible. So that's just an idea that I'll put out there for further discussion. And one more point I want to make. We hear a lot of talk about, well, the RTOs are doing it, or the RTOs need to strengthen their process, or the RTOs need to be more transparent. I think that's all fine. As a solution, I would not put that as an or, I'd put that as an and. Fine, increase the transparency at the RTOs. No one's against that. But it's not a magic bullet. The RTO planning processes, no matter which RTO you want to pick, are not litigated CPCN proceedings. They're planning processes, and that's all they're ever going to be. But yeah, fine. Let's talk about ways to improve the transparency. Fine. Who's against that? But it is not an alternative to encouraging states to have the authority they ought to have to do a credible, fully litigated CPCN proceeding and really dig into whether, and the two big issues are always cost and need. Is the cost prudent? Is the need proven? So those are the comments I would make at this point, and look forward to hearing from others about what they think about this.
And let's hold off on people's reactions to the solutions that you propose, because we're going to get into that in a few minutes. But does anybody else, before we move on to the last question here, have any comments? Okay, we're a little behind, and I don't want to rob the solutions conversation. So let's just move to the last question in this area, which is, are there instances where regulators lack sufficient expertise or resources, such as modeling and engineering, to conduct sufficient need and prudence review of local and regional transmission projects? And if so, what types of expertise or resources are needed to inform regulators? And for this, we've got, we're going to start with Chair Stanek, then Commissioner Duffy, and then Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. I would argue that state commissions who are perpetually resource constrained should not necessarily be in the business of conducting transmission studies on the bulk power system. It's expensive. We do not always have CPCN applications before us at any given time. And the fact of the matter is some of our agencies are very small. I know Chair LaVar does everything except empty the trash cans at night at the Utah PSC. That being said, as Commissioner Christie just mentioned, either there is a ton of discovery for the commissions go through, and that takes resources, or there's not a lot of information to go through. So there's no discovery to conduct. So when faced with this resource constraint, the commissions oftentimes look towards other resources or assistance. We'll talk about the ITM later on in the session, but for the time being, I think there's three places we could look for help. One of them possibly is the FERC, our big brother, our partner in this situation here, because they have the staffing. They have some of the expertise that the states don't have. I recognize that the states would need to compensate FERC if any resources or consulting services were provided. The second benefit for those of us who are in RTOs is to seek assistance with the RTO. And I know that PJM has staffed up in recent years. They created their State Policy Solutions Group. They've extended an open hand to their states, 13 states plus the District of Columbia, to assist with some of this lack of resources. But third, most importantly, and this puts some responsibility back on the PSCs and POCs, is for us to work together, particularly if we're working on regional solutions, let's say in MACRUC, a line that goes from Pennsylvania to Maryland. Instead of Pennsylvania conducting its own study, hiring its own engineers, Maryland hiring its own contractors, that we begin to pool some of these resources just to make the most efficient use of time and the limited dollars that we have. I think these are some solutions that we haven't necessarily looked at in recent years, but with this transmission build out, they keep saying it's coming, it's on the horizon. And we know the IOUs are investing 20, 30 $billion. These projects are going to be coming to a state near you very soon.
Commissioner Duffy.
Thank you. As a reminder, I represent CRUC, which is mainly filled with, it's a non-RTO region. And the other CRUC states that I've spoken with are similar to Pennsylvania. They feel like they their processes are robust and they have sufficient resources. However, as you just heard me respond to Commissioner Phillips, there are other non-RTO states or consumer advocates within the non-RTO states that need those additional resources and are seeking those additional resources. And I think the reason for this is what Commissioner Christie stated. There has to be a bit more review of transmission build because of the increasing cost, and the drivers are changing because the driver used to be, especially in the southern states, reliability, or you build transmission for new load. But now we're seeing end of life issues has become a big issue. The load pockets are changing and we're seeing generation retirements. And so it makes sense to have more scrutiny over transmission build. How each of the states choose to perform that scrutiny, I think from a CRUC perspective is up to each individual state. The second part of the question requests what types of expertise and resources are needed. And again, the North Carolina Public Staff sent out an RFQ and it spelled out some of the needs, which included modeling expertise and analysts of power flow in Duke and the regional interties, as well as the ability to assist with questions and information requests in both the local and regional transmission process, as well as hearings before the NCUC. And I think with that, if a commission decides, or public advocate within a commission decides to take all of this in-house, I think one way they can perform the modeling, they're going to have access to the models. They're going to hire a couple of engineers to perform the models, as well as have another staff member to kind of take that engineer legalese and explain it to everyone else. Thank you.
Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm on. One of the things that's exciting to me about this topic is we get to figure this out. There isn't something we have to undo that has been done, because all of the processes are in place, whether it be the state CPCM process or FERC's jurisdictional planning processes. Figuring out an efficient way to do cost management is an addition. It can be a useful addition. I don't think any of us are interested in stymieing or slowing down needed transmission development, but this isn't a question, to Commissioner Christie's point, of money's going to get spent, it's how it's going to get spent. And so I think we can acknowledge differences in regions across the country. We can say, yeah, this is the kind of thing that would work in an RTO, but this is a different thing in non-RTOs. And so we can come at it in a way that hopefully we all feel that this kind of generic imposition of cost management isn't what, at least from my seat, we're aiming for. At the technical conference, we heard from almost every state that increased support and resources would be good. What that looked like and whether the use or being forced to take us up on the opportunity to have that support and resources perhaps is a different question. But the idea that both the ability to access information and then the separate problem of being able to Commissioner Duffley's point, analyze all that information and use it well, seem to be a consistent theme. And you can't separate out this conversation from the regional transmission planning conversation. You know, one of the things that happened because of this task force is we tried to give states a seat at the table in the planning process early on, not just in the middle, but early on. And that exacerbates the need, right? If you're going to come to that table, you then need the information and the analysis to be able to effectively participate. Otherwise, it's just another strain on already strained set of resources. And it's not a replacement for state CPN by no means. The FERC jurisdictional process is an input into it. And if we're doing effective regional transmission planning, then gosh, as a state regulator, I won't pretend to know all the things that go through your head, but that would be helpful to understand once that project gets to you that, yeah, that was a more efficient choice than the one that might have otherwise been made had it not gone through an effective regional transmission planning process. You know, at FERC, we also have resource constraints, right? We have an office of, I always mix up all the names of the offices at FERC, but in our OAL offices, our rate litigation offices, we have experts who put testimony into proceedings relative to prudence and need, but they can't do that for every transmission project. They can't do that for every transmission or owning utility. That would be too much. What are what is the wish list of that information that states need that we could help provide? Is it something like, this formula rate solution that Commissioner Christie has described, or applying to some subset of projects that are coming to the commission? Is there some way of getting utilities to provide standardized information to FERC akin to, Form 1 filings that are consistent, that then states know they're getting they might do what they want with that information, but at least it's maybe perhaps more of an apples to apples opportunity. We're going to talk more about an independent transmission monitor, but in the case that you're in an RTO region and there's a lot of planning going on and a lot of analysis getting done, is that one way to help bring the information down to a level that it's then digestible for state participants and other stakeholders? So I think there's a lot of potential solutions. The comments that we get, if there ever has been a time where I say, I don't know what the right answer is, but I really look forward to hearing the comments that you all provide in response to this conversation. This is that time. Thanks.
So we're about 10 minutes behind. We want to move on to solutions, but I'd like to just get any concise final comments, and particular also from some of the task force members that weren't included in the round robin. If you want to jump in, that would be great. So okay, I'm gonna move around this way. We'll end Chair Zutrell.
Thank you. In the course of the conversation, as we've been discussing things, I found it very insightful, first of all, and the conversation in terms of Chairman Stanek and states bringing together resources is very interesting as well. But when we're looking at the resources that we have in Pennsylvania, my emphasis has always been on when we're talking about local projects that require new siting. And I showed you or talked about the other type of ones that, we have less of a review. And that's probably because we made a decision of what resources we had and how we could best use those resources. And those are on the ones that have a new siting requirement. So building upon new staff, additional staff to build up that expertise is some of the challenges that I think not only Pennsylvania would see, but other states as well. And then also when we look at that, we have to look at our individual state requirements in terms of the expertise and whether or not we could even increase our complement. Because I laugh at times when I say we're an independent agency, but the request to increase our complement comes through the governor's office. That's by statute, so can't be changed. And then also when we're looking about sharing resources across state lines, it would be interesting to see all the just different administrative requirements in terms of doing just that. So I think all of that comes into the mix in terms of the discussion as to whether we can do all that. So thank you.
Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you. I did want to bring up one more distinction between RTO and non-RTO states that we heard at the technical conference, and it's the fact of bundled transmission. So we heard Southern companies stated that 90% of the transmission is bundled, and in the Duke Energy territories, 70 to 75% is bundled. And so I wanted to provide an example in North Carolina that I can think of an instance where there has been a disallowance through that prudency review through the retail rate case, where the disallowance related to undergrounding of a portion of a transmission line, which, as we all know, can sometimes be triple the cost. And so that in the retail rate case, the incremental cost of the undergrounding was disallowed. So that is a distinction between non-RTO states as opposed to RTO states. And the one other solution to help with states that may not have the resources, I don't know if there is funding through the Department of Energy that can be given to those states.
Mr. Allen.
Yeah, I just have a brief comment, which is I think it's also important that FERC and the states are recognize it's a dynamic environment. It's not just all about FERC essentially applying more of its rate investigation resources to the problem, but recognize that there are messaging and criteria that can be put out there that can encourage states to be essentially a more effective partner in the process of reviewing the large capital projects that are coming along.
Commissioner Christie.
Yeah, the resource issue has been a huge issue for a long time. I remember 10 years ago, literally begging NRRI, which was the research arm of NARUC, literally begging them to develop a list of expert witnesses who could come and testify in state proceedings. Never happened. So I hope that NARUC maybe over the next year might make a priority of whether you get grant money from DOE or work through the regional groups like OPSI to just get a list of expert witnesses that could testify in state proceedings, because that's been a huge problem. And that applies non-RTO and RTO. I mean, an expert witness is so hard to get. The good ones have been hired by the transmission owners. So it's hard to find somebody who hadn't already been conflicted out. But NARUC could really take the lead on that and start building a stable of witnesses and make them available. Second point I'd make is if you're in an RTO, even if you don't have a lot of staff, which a lot of states don't, you can call the witness from the RTO, put them on the stand and cross-examine them and ask them to explain the evidence and the reasoning behind why they put this project into the regional plan. And remember, another critical difference between a state proceeding and the regional planning process. In a state proceeding, the applicant bears the burden. So the applicant, i.e. the transmission owner, has to bear the burden of proving to you that the line is needed. So you don't have to prove anything. They have to prove it. So you call the RTO witness and say, you got to show us why you put this in the RTAP. Show us your evidence. So the burden's on them. I mean, it's on the TO and they can call the RTO witness. So point is, even if you don't have a single resource, you still have the ability to put somebody on the stand, cross-examine them, and the burden's going to be on the applicant. So it changes the dynamic entirely from what an RTO planning process is, where there is no burden.
Ending this section where we began, Commissioner Phillips.
Very quickly, I wanted to make a similar point as Commissioner Christie, share my past experiences with resource issues. Also wanted Chair Stanek remind me of a project that we had that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, the Capital Grid project. And our problem wasn't just in the modeling side. When you get to the cost recovery phase, when you talk about prudency review, access to information, we had terrible time trying to get confidential information, and that's a FOIA problem for the District of Columbia. But even if you can get the information, and even if you can have auditors, even if you can have accountants who can review this information, it can be very challenging to actually determine whether or not a cost is imprudent. At least that's my experience.
Right. So using this as a springboard of what the gaps are that we're trying to fill, we're going to spend the rest of the morning just looking at a few solutions that have come up in the technical session and other places and chew on those collectively. And the first is an independent transmission monitor, and what the scope, roles, and responsibilities would be. And I'm just going to read the questions and then we'll launch into the opening remarks. So what are the potential benefits and opportunities for an ITM to address the identified gaps challenges? And are there alternatives to an ITM that could address these identified gaps? And then if an ITM, what are the specific wants and needs? For instance, what information and analysis are needed today that isn't available, and how could an ITM fill that need? What functions could the ITM perform, and for whom and how? And when considering whether an ITM could adequately perform various functions identified, are there timing considerations? E.g., when would certain analysis by the ITM need to be completed relative to the planning process and the regulatory review processes? And are the wants and needs of an ITM different between RTO and non-RTO regions? And I think we heard this morning, even within RTO and non-RTO regions, there could be very significant differences among states in those regions. So we're going to start with Commissioner Houck, and then Commissioner French, and Chair French, and then Chair Pridemore. And then we'll hear from Commissioner Clements and Chair Glick. And then I think what I'll do is then probably after everybody goes, we're going to take a very short break, and then we're going to have the discussion. So, okay, here we go.
Thank you. I'm going to discuss the how an ITM could address regulatory gaps and what the potential functions for an ITM are. So this morning we were discussing current gaps in the regulatory process. We discussed information and expertise asymmetries that exist between interveners and utilities, and that we need improvements to regulatory oversight to address these gaps. The Commission introduced the concept of an independent transmission monitor and the ANOPR as one potential solution for improving oversight of transmission facility cost. And the California Public Utilities Commission, or CPUC, recommends that the Commission should require RTOs and ISOs to establish independent transmission monitors that provide oversight of transmission spending and specify certain responsibilities, which I'll discuss in a moment, those responsibilities. And this would ensure that transmission investment needed to accommodate future needs of the grid will be both cost effective and targeted to realize the maximum benefit for consumers. We emphasize in our comments in response to the ANOPR that there are other critically needed reforms apart from the ITM, including, as was noted by NARUC and other commenters, that the Commission should apply Order 890 transparent planning principles to asset management and replacement projects. And we urge the Commission to improve upon and expand the use of competitive processes. So we're submitting today that an ITM should not be viewed as a substitute for these and other essential reforms, but instead, as the ANOPR proposes, that it should be understood as an additional means of ensuring that rates are just and reasonable. That said, ITMs can play a significant role in helping to address the primary gaps identified in the Commission's existing regulatory framework in two fundamental ways. First, ITMs would provide an independent assessment of the need for and cost of regional and local transmission projects, including asset management and replacement projects. This would include an evaluation of the utility's prioritization decisions and a holistic consideration of project alternatives. Second, the independent expert analysis provided by an ITM would help mitigate the information and expertise asymmetries between interveners and utilities, and most importantly, help interveners identify and substantiate their concerns in regional planning processes and before FERC. For this to work, of course, FERC would need to require utilities to disclose the requisite data that would enable the ITM to assess the need and cost of proposed transmission projects in comparison to alternatives. And so what should the ITM functions include? At the October 6th FERC technical conference, there was a lot of discussion regarding the potential scope of an ITM, and the California Public Utilities Commission recommends that ITMs have certain core responsibilities, but also recognizes the needs in each region and or state and single state ISOs may differ, and therefore the scope of the ITM should be decided on a regional or statewide basis. ITMs would be funded through transmission rates, therefore they must provide a direct benefit to ratepayers. And what this means in practice is that whether the new entity is a ratepayer transmission monitor or an independent transmission monitor, and I believe both were discussed at the October 6th technical conference, the new entity must be an independent. It has to be independent from the RTO or the ISO and accountable to state commissions, other relevant government agencies, ratepayers, and their advocates. And it should be required to respond to reasonable requests by the applicable states and other entities that it's accountable to. The fundamental purpose of an ITM or RTM would be to ensure stakeholder questions about need for, cost of, and potential alternatives to proposed projects are answered by an independent entity with requisite technical expertise. And we propose 6 core functions for an ITM that would apply to regional projects, local projects, and asset management replacement projects. These core functions are: 1, develop benchmark cost estimates; 2, monitor actual project costs compared to estimates; 3, monitor progress and assess continued need for incomplete projects; 4, assess the prudency of selected projects as compared to alternatives; 5, monitor compliance with planning requirements, for example, compliance with application of Order 890 transparent planning principles; and 6, periodically issue public reports that describe the state of transmission spending and compliance with planning requirements within its region or state. For the ITM to work and specifically enable stakeholders to effectively participate in transmission planning decisions, timing considerations are critical, and we conceptualize 4 stages for transmission planning as assumptions, which includes consideration of generation portfolios and load forecast, identification of transmission needs, identification of solutions, which could be transmission projects or grid enhancing technologies or non-wire alternatives, and implementation of solutions. For regional and local transmission planning processes, the ITM would need at a minimum to provide analysis at the needs, solution, and implementation stages. And I say at a minimum because some regions may need ITMs to have a more expansive transmission planning oversight role, and therefore also be involved in reviewing the assumptions behind the utilities and RTO's identification of transmission needs. By contrast, the PUC submits, the California Public Utilities Commission, sorry, I'm used to being in California, where we're submits that for asset management and replacement projects, because these projects are either not independently reviewed at all, as in the Cal ISO, or inadequately reviewed, as in the case for supplemental projects in PJM, the ITM would necessarily need to provide analysis at all 4 stages of the transmission process. And to underscore this point, the ITM would need to understand the utility's assumptions for why the utility has proposed asset management and replacement projects in lieu of other alternatives, such as potential regional projects, and in turn transparently provide that information and the ITM's independent analysis of the utility's determination to stakeholders.
Thank you for that very detailed and specific proposal for an ITM. Let's keep moving. Chair French.
Thank you. Well, I will say I've got a lot of agreement with what Commissioner Houck just said, so I'm going to try to say the same thing in different words and be very brief. But my first comment would be in response to some things that Commissioner Christie said. First of all, I watched the technical conference and I was very heartened to see a lot of folks coalesce around the same gaps and challenges that Kansas has been seeing for the last 10 or 15 years. And, you know, we probably figured we weren't alone, but it's nice to know we're not alone, that everybody is struggling with these same issues. We've been dealing with escalating transmission costs. I'm not saying that these are unwarranted costs or that they aren't investments that are maybe paying for themselves in some ways, but costs have been going up on the bill. We break out transmission on the bill as a separate line item. I can tell you 10 or 15 years ago, for a typical residential customer, it was about $4. Now it's in the range of 20. And we know where the capital spending is moving in the next 10 or 15 years. That number is going to go up. So just some general comments to say, I share your pocketbook concerns. But let's get into the ITM role. First of all, I may or may not be a little different on this. I want to talk about first where I don't think the ITM is going to be really helpful. I agree with some of the comments Chair Glick made to start that in an RTO region that has a really robust planning process, I don't think regional planning is something that the ITM is going to be helpful to come in and second guess. Our RTOs already are independent, not for profit. The larger projects are going to be subject to competition, and probably most importantly, at least in an RTO like mine in the Southwest Power Pool, for those regionally planned projects, they're going to get regional cost sharing, which means all the stakeholders are going to carefully scrutinize everybody else's projects if they're sharing a piece of the pie. So larger regional projects, I don't see a role for the ITM there. I just want to be very clear, at least from the SPP perspective. But like many other people have said, I really do see that the ITM could help address the regulatory gap associated with local transmission planning. There is no doubt that there is a lot of need for investment in local transmission right now. But you do pair that with the favorable rate making treatment, and we are seeing a flood of capital investment into that area, and that just screams out for more oversight. So, what exactly do I think the role is? I think saying it in slightly different words than Commissioner Houck did, we need help examining the pace of investment and whether transmission owners are making the most optimal investments. It's almost unchallengeable to say that the utilities shouldn't be engaging in some form of replacement of assets that are 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. But what we think may be challengeable is how you replace those assets and when you replace those assets. So, first, just the example of pace. I mean, it goes back to pocketbook. I mean, how fast you replace those has an enormous impact on what the rate outcome is. If you can space out investments and you can let some depreciation roll off and invest in a little longer timeline, that helps you greatly in what the rate impact is. And I'll just be frank, transmission formula rates don't help you there. If there's no cap on what you can place into that spreadsheet, there's no limit on pace. And then I'll just quickly skip to the second rule. Just as I think pace may be something that's challengeable, I think how you address transmission needs on the local system is also something that deserves some more scrutiny. Right now, with a formula rate, it is really easy to just rebuild the system as it exists. Those are the most easy projects to get through. In many cases, a transmission owner can make that choice unilaterally and just place it right in. It's not going to be subject to scrutiny. And so there just is an incentive to push for a more optimized, maybe even a bigger solution. So I think an ITM could have a real role in helping figure out, benchmarking, standardized metrics, help us figure out which transmission owners are being most efficient with their dollars, are making the most optimal solutions, who is doing the best job of acquiring right of way at the lowest cost. I think, as we talk about this at our commission, we would like to see the ITM more as an information repository. Help us gather standardized metrics to understand which utilities are doing a good job of making the most optimized solutions. And then, on pace, maybe you gather what are the best practices for how you prioritize projects. I know, for gas utilities on the distribution system, they all have distribution integrity management plans that tell them exactly how they pace out their investments. Now, granted, that's a lot easier than the pretty dynamic transmission system, but perhaps the ITM could help develop standardized or best practices for local transmission investments and the pace of those investments. So, I'm trying to be really quick here, but I think the pace and the how, best practices, repository of information that we can use to understand which TOs are doing a good job and maybe which aren't being efficient. I think that'd be incredibly helpful, but let me put one downer at the end of that, which is I hesitate to ask for all this information because at the end of the day, if states, other stakeholders, customers are given all this information and we still have the same formula rate framework, it's then on us to take that information and to go engage in litigation to make a case. And I'm just not sure that's the most effective way to regulate and to move things forward. Frankly, I would like to see, changes in economic incentives. I prefer a lighter touch than just setting up more litigation. But I'll just make that as a preview to maybe future comments.
Preview to our formula rate discussion. Chair Pridemore.
Good morning. I'm here, as you all know, to represent the CRUC states. I promise to have an equal amount of passion as my good friend, Chairman Chandler from Kentucky has on this issue. But we tend to disagree on a lot of things. I don't know if his passion comes from his Mark side or his CRUC side, but he's a fine man. So in the states that I've spoken with in depth on this issue of an ITM, particularly Mississippi and Florida, I was encouraged to tell Georgia's story. And so I did write some remarks today because I did take a different approach to this as my friends, Commissioner Houck and Commissioner French. So yes, I'm proud to serve the entire state of Georgia on the Georgia Public Service Commission. Myself and my other 4 commissioners, we are all statewide elected. So we are accountable to the voters. We're accountable to the citizens of Georgia. And it is their interests that we set up first. I'm honored to serve on this task force in a position formerly held by Commissioner Emeritus Ted Thomas from Arkansas. Ted is also another good friend, good man. But in addressing the question of define the scope, roles, and responsibilities of an independent transmission monitor, I want to back up and ask the question, why is an ITM even necessary? For 9 consecutive years, the state of Georgia has been rated the #1 state in which to do business. We've put $6 billion in our rainy day fund and created over 1 million new private sector jobs in the last 8 years. All the while, we've done so by having electric rates 15% below the national average. In 2021, Georgia is tied for #1 in energy, and we're 4th in the nation in solar energy scoped and approved through a robust and rigorous integrated resource planning process. It includes generation, demand side management, and transmission. That IRP process, specifically the IRP transmission portion, is created by the vertically integrated investor-owned utility in cooperation with the system operator for 41 electric co-ops and the action agency for the state's 49 municipal power companies. The transmission needs of the state comes before the Georgia Public Service Commission through this rigorous IRP research, hearings, and a commission-driven decision. This collaboration has been perfected over decades of thoughtful management that puts the needs of Georgia first. By the way, it is this level of team collaboration that is also what it takes to build new nuclear generation as well. It's tested, tried, and effective, and we pride ourselves in Georgia to do hard things. We operate without an RTO while never having a blackout, brownout, forced curtailment, all the while in a strong economy with year-over-year growth. Not a single failure. Our bottom-up approach, coupled with collaboration in-state through GITS, the Georgia Integrated Transmission System monthly meetings, and regionally through CERTEP, the Southeastern Regional Transmission Planning Process, 14 members provide intra and interstate coordination. NERC guidance with our bottom-up approach maintains reliability and does not put upward pressure on rates. The 2 things that every company scoping economic development in our nation look for. For example, in just the last 4 years, Georgia has won 2 of the nation's largest economic development deals, both in electric vehicle manufacturing, by the way. And they didn't choose Georgia because they wanted an RTO or an ITM from the federal government. So in explaining our bottom-up approach and willingness to do the hard things that Georgians expect us to do, I want to encourage state commissioners. You can do it too. If it's a lack of expertise, talk to your governors and your legislators. Secure the budget, the staff, and the consultants to get it done. If it's scope and collaboration, let the state of Georgia provide an example of state-based decision-making. Your citizens expect you to provide a safe, reliable, and affordable electric service, and you have the authority to do it without a top-down governance structure. That structure will only delay projects, including renewable implementation, increase ratepayers' costs at as much as 90%, because transmission costs, we all know, they're rate-based. But maybe most importantly, it lessens your authority, commissioners, to do the hard things that simply must be done.
Thank you. Commissioner Clements and then Chair Glick.
Thank you. I appreciate the specific perspectives you provided on what an ITM might look like. It helps to make this a lot more of a concrete conversation than just this idea of this kind of floating, scary potential albatross, which I don't think anyone is intending it to be. You said a lot of the things that I wanted to say. And so I just want to hone in on you provided several sets of important or helpful inputs, Commissioner Houck, and one of them is the stages in the planning process at which an ITM might be useful in your experience. And I think thinking about, the inputs and assumption phase, and then the planning phase, and then the selection phase, and then the cost allocation, that's helpful. the conversation has been more before you get to costs being spent than once they're being spent, and to monitor them. I hear you both saying that people at the technical conference didn't say as much about that. And it feels like a different bucket of responsibility. I know, MISO has experience with doing variance analysis. I think I understand that to be the case. So to my mind, I've been thinking about this role on the front end as much. And so I'm interested to process your comments on the back end piece around like costs as benchmarked and then spent and implemented. I'm processing your comment, Chair French, on the issue of local versus regional projects that have these other competitive forces weighing down on them in regional planning processes. And I would ask about, in addition to the local, do you think, and I don't know what SPP has in terms of regional reliability projects and whether or not which side of your perspective those fall on. I'm also hearing differences between RTOs and non-RTOs. We've heard this throughout. I think there was a desire for help outside of the RTOs. But as I think about it, in the existing RTOs, you've got robust planning processes and there's just information overload and analysis paralysis almost. That's the problem we're trying to get at there. Outside of the RTOs, I mean, maybe the question is more about whether or not the FERC jurisdictional regional planning processes in those regions that do exist are sufficiently robust and independent. And that's a different question and perhaps not one that the ITM is best targeted for, but again, open to thoughts on that front.
Sure.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say, Chair Pridemore, it sounds like we all need to move to Georgia. Things are. But a couple of things. First of all, with regard to the technical conference that we had back in early October, I was actually surprised that there wasn't unanimity, to be sure, but there was a lot of support for this idea of an independent transmission monitor. Now, I think, it's kind of like a Rorschach test that you kind of see in it what you want, right? And I think there's a lot of people have different views of what the ITM would do, but I think there's a couple things, and I think Commissioner Clements and Chair French kind of addressed one of them, which is, from an independence perspective, it's not just cost review, and cost review is very important because as we heard from a number of commenters in several states at our technical conference, there just sometimes isn't the necessary information, the data, or the expertise sometimes at certain state commissions to really go through the costs in a very in a deep enough manner to really to ensure that consumers are adequately protected. But also from there's an incentive out there for entities and utilities in particular to build some of these local projects as opposed to some of the more robust regional projects. A lot of it has to do with the way we handle ROFR, and that's for another discussion for another day. But there is that incentive out there, and we've seen in some regions just a ballooning, and California is one of them, but there are other regions as well, a ballooning of the number of local projects. And I think there's a sense of a need for an independent monitor in part to assess whether the planning process isn't being outweighed by the incentive to build those local projects and earn a good rate of return and so on. And I think that's something I think the independent monitor probably it's an issue that an independent monitor should address. And then I would the point Commissioner Clements raised, what I think is a good one, which is it's not just the review of the cost up front as to whether the project is prudently the decision was made to prudently build the project, but as the project construction, the development projects process goes on, for a variety of reasons, we see a lot of cost overruns. And how do we ensure those cost overruns are adequately there's adequate oversight to make sure consumers don't pay too much? And I know that MISO has a process, as I understand it, where if a project goes 25% over the estimate, they take another look at it, and that may be an opportunity for the independent monitor as well. So those are the areas I think there's a lot of interest in, but also to Chair Pridemore's point, and it very well may be that it's not we don't need an ITM in every region of the country, especially regions that don't have RTOs. Those are things we all need to talk about, but every region is different. Every region has a different situation, but it may be that the states and non-RTO regions have sufficient authority and sufficient capability there.
So that was a great opening remarks, and we want to have a discussion about the ITM and hear from others. We're behind schedule, for our ambitious agenda. So we're going to take, instead of a 10-minute break, we're going to try and do the impossible, which is a 5-minute break. It's 9:35. We'll start at 9:40. If the audience could give the task force a minute lead time to go to the bathroom and get coffee before you get up, that would be helpful. And then you can go and come. So task force members, don't dally. Get your coffee, your water, your bio break. And if the audience, just give them a minute or two for a head start.
Okay.
All right, if everybody could take their seats. I'm going to go yell in the hallway. 1 second.
They're all by the coffee.
Dr. Rob doesn't mess around.
Are they really out of coffee?
No, I'm saying they're by, they have for us, yeah.
So let's, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we had great opening remarks on this, and we want to hear from others. What do others think? Similar, different? Is an ITM needed? If so, what should they do? And in particular, also, what would they do in non-RTO regions? So if we can, Chair LeVar, you were first, and then Commissioner Allen, then Chair Stanek.
Thanks. I just want to give a follow-up to one of the concepts that Chair Pridemore was talking about. Obviously, in the RTO regions, an independent monitor is a FERC decision on whether to impose one on RTOs. But in the non-RTO regions, there are really a lot of options that states can choose that use similar functions. And whether it's a commission decision or whether it has to be a statutory decision in the state, it's an option that can provide a lot of value to the RTO states absent FERC action. And so that's, I think, something to consider in those areas.
So things like hiring consultants and getting the expertise other ways. I
mean, I could describe the way we do it in Utah and also Oregon, but I don't know if that's a good use of time here, but there are lots of options for how they could be structured and paid for.
Commissioner Allen.
Try to be efficient. Through the lens that I think about this, I think there are kind of 3 broad categories of functions that an ITM can play. One is in the kind of planning role and providing technical assistance in that role. I think there's a potentially a cost oversight and transparency, some of the data issues that have been alluded to that will kind of empower states or advocates in the review process. But there's another category, which is, I think, more kind of structural and process related, recognizing that there are going to be seams in the process, or there are seams in the process that can be addressed. I mean, there's lots of examples, but I mean, state laws and the way they kind of view regional problems and review projects through a local lens rather than a regional lens as they apply the CPHCN process. I think having another expert and voice out there that has, some cachet with the respective states in a region would be helpful. And there's a long list of things I could go through, but I'm not going to go through them. The point about that Chair French made about a role for a ITM in the region. I don't like to disagree with Chair French, and I avoid it at all costs. I'm not going to disagree with him because I know he is talking about his region, but I think within our region, the ITM would be particularly helpful in the planning frame. I think that's particularly so as we think about some of the planning reforms that we're going to be implementing on a region by region and state by state basis that will be flowing from, essentially the NOPR process that we're looking at. I'm imagining that there's going to be a lot of flexibility that is left to the states and to the regions to implement this. I think there are choices that are going to be made. I think having a kind of a state voice through an expert in this area will be particularly instrumental. I think that was highlighted by Bob Ethier of ISO New England when he provided comments at the technical conference. Another aspect of Chair French's comments, it just and Chair Pridemore's comments was just the diversity of views. I think there's a rich diversity of needs and views of where the ITM would be most helpful. I think respecting that makes a great deal of sense to me. And I would encourage the commission as they think about this to allow states and regions to essentially opt into the frameworks that best suit their needs if they choose to kind of move in this direction. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Chairman Stanek.
Thank you. The ITM is an intriguing concept, but it's not a new concept. 6 years ago, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware filed a request at FERC in one of the AD dockets, requesting an independent cost management monitor. And this ITM concept sounds very familiar to that proposal. It sounds like we do have some diversity amongst the state commissioners, and that is just fine. Listening to the October 6th conference, I heard some of the concerns expressed by the RTOs, asking if an ITM is necessary in their regions. They are the independent transmission planner. You have an independent market monitor. You have an independent federal agency. Do we need a fourth independent overseer in this arena? And I think the verdict is still out. It may depend on your region. It may depend on your RTO. We're continuing to look at it because we are concerned about cost escalations on projects that might not have a watchful eye over them. And it's just something that I'm glad that we're having this open debate today.
Thank you. Chair Scripps and then Chair Nelson.
I said earlier that I probably have more questions than answers throughout most of this, and it's true here as well. But just a couple of pieces to pick up. I think conceptually, I like the idea of an independent review, particularly on some of the local projects, locally planned projects that have been driving some of the increases that we've seen. And I think the details are important as well. And I think there are a couple of critical issues that in my mind, continue to need to be addressed as we think about this. The first, Chairman Glick, you talked about, I think that larger projects are getting more of a thorough review, and I've heard that from others as well, and that some of the challenges in the aggregation of smaller projects. One of the questions I have is can an ITM, if you think of them as sort of similarly structured to the independent market monitors with a small team, effectively monitor a large suite of relatively small projects, and how you actually get your arms around that if it's actually the smaller projects, but a large number of them that are driving the increases. The second issue that I think needs to be resolved, and again, I don't want this to come across as either for or against the ITM issue, it's just the issues that I am wrestling with is essentially, to Commissioner Christie's point, that that RTO planning was never going to be the same and isn't the same as a fully litigated CPCN process. It's a planning process. And I'm, I guess, unclear whether an ITM changes that reality or just adds transparency. And then to Chairman French's point, if we get the information, what do we ultimately do with it? And then the third big issue that I think picks up on something I heard from Commissioner Clements and Commissioner Howe is around the timeline. And Commissioner Clements, I think you said specifically, this can't slow down transmission development. And I fully agree with that. I think for all the concerns that we have on cost containment, I think they're legitimate. Transmission is important here. And so how does an ITM do its work within the context of a transmission planning processes that are tightly time bound? It's one thing to say, oh, this can be an open-ended process. If it takes 3 years, it takes 3 years. It's another thing to do that in the MISO context, for example, within an 18-month rolling annual MTEP process without slowing down the projects that are absolutely critical to keep pace with reliability. So as we think through these are some of the issues, again, more questions than answers, but that I'm wrestling with for how an idea that I think has some attractive elements in terms of the independent review might operate in practice.
Chair Nelson.
So I think my two comments are around building off of something Chair French said, as well as talking a little bit about governance. So I'd start by saying I think the reality is we should make sure that the ITM works for the place that it's being instituted. And I think right now, I think some of the things Chair French said was talking about optimization, talking about right sizing. we think a lot about the ITM in terms of cost, and I think that's right, but it's not just a cost thing, especially if it's incorporated into planning, right? We're doing a whole NOPR on broad-based benefits. And I think ultimately we want to make sure we're building transmission projects that bring the most benefits to consumers. And that is a possible area where you could see an ITM helping in a planning setup. And I think, I agree with Commissioner Allen that in the New England region, not vertically integrated, right? So in a different state than a lot of, a different place rather, than a lot of other regions that are vertically integrated and have a lot more oversight into both their generation and transmission assets. I think an ITM could be incredibly useful. But I do think that at the end, I do see the ITM line and reporting going to FERC, right? FERC still has the prudence and has to do the reviews. So I think the FERC should also make sure that if an ITM is going in place, that the ITM is useful for FERC in the information you're getting back for the region that you need. So yeah, it's good for states, but I don't see the ITM reporting to states or to another stakeholder. I think ultimately they're providing information that'll be valuable to FERC in making their decisions and making sure regions are functioning appropriately.
Commissioner Christie.
I just have a question for Chair Stanek. You mentioned that a few years ago, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, I think, went to FERC and filed for an independent cost control monitor. I don't remember hearing about that in OPSI. What happened?
That's a good question. I don't believe FERC acted on that proposal. So I'll have to find that AD docket proceeding, but it's like many things at FERC, you file it and you don't hear back. We will look into.
Did somebody not have the job to follow up?
We'll get back to you, Chair Stanek.
Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you. One of the things I always do when I walk into a new room is always try to look for another way out, different than the way I came in. I think when it comes to creating new regulatory entities and things, I feel similarly. I always want to say, what can go wrong? If it goes wrong, how do I get out of it? And so I'm very interested in hearing alternatives to the ITM. I'm also interested in hearing ideas around how to control it. One of the things that I'm very familiar with is the ERO model with NERC. We established NERC as ERO. They said, we're going to do this every 5 years. Every 5 years, we're going to take another look, another review, and sort of reaffirm or assert you or reappoint you as the ERO. I'm curious to know if that's something that folks would be interested in this context. I have another question, though. I hear a lot of people talk about, what if we just do this in RTO regions and we don't do it in non-RTO regions? Well, are we creating a perverse incentive people to actually leave an RTO if this doesn't turn out the way that everybody thinks it will? Thank you.
So does anybody want to add anything else on this before we move on, which you're free to do? Chair French, that's fine. Go ahead. Normally, we would have a little bit more time to digest and for me to push a little bit, but I'm trying to be respectful of getting through the agenda. Chair French.
I'm just real quick, and maybe this addresses both of those questions to some degree. I mean, I can tell you in conversations with our staff, when I was putting together my thoughts on what an ITM could do around creating standardized metrics, helping do benchmarking of different utilities. I mean, frankly, we talked a lot about how useful we think EIA data is, just to have standardized metrics across the nation, be able to make comparisons. You always have to compensate for regional differences, but it's just important to have that information as a repository. And that's how I viewed this, is not necessarily RTO by RTO. I viewed it as one overarching information repository that stakeholders could access and use. So I don't know if that's exactly responsive, but that's our perspective on how we envisioned it.
Chair Jutro.
Thank you. I don't want to add too much to it, but point out the fact that through the course of our conversation in terms of the independent transmission monitor, I know Pennsylvania was a state that put comments on the record as part of the ANOPR. And I have appreciated the conversation and even looking at what has been discussed in terms that the technical conference of the concerns in terms of having an ITM, the role of the ITM, what they could do. I mean, my state came from an approach of having more additional resources for us to assist us in this process. But looking at some of the conversations, I've appreciated and have tried to evolve in terms of where we should go with the ITM. So I just throw that out to everyone here that there's a lot of good conversation, and we just need to, I won't say push pause, but at least take it all in and see where we can go with it.
Commissioner Danley.
So one thing that I'll mention, 2 points actually very briefly. The first is certainly when we hear people talk to us about the transmission monitor, it is far from universally positive. There are a handful of people who, when they talk to me, are in favor, but for the most part, it's negative. So I just want to disabuse anybody of the sense that there is anything even approaching unanimity, and that the distinctions are merely in how it would function rather than that it be. I want to put that out there. And then second, one alternative is, Commissioner Phillips, the alternative, I think, to having a transmission monitor is for the state and federal commissions to do what they can to robustly engage in their job of rate making. The last 30 years of FERC, let's say 30-ish, have seen us go to greater and greater levels of abstraction, getting further and further away from the paradigmatic method of rate cases that are the old way of doing business. And it strikes me that the idea of the transmission monitor is yet another one of those abstractions that you layer upon a process that removes FERC even further from its ultimate responsibility to make sure the rates are JNR.
Commissioner Allen, and we're going to talk about formula rates, at least in a moment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more dimension to the ITM concept, which is it's possible that you could create an entity and it actually might evolve, or its usefulness will kind of change with the passage of time. In the early innings, it may be focused on kind of longer term structural and process fixes. Over time, it could kind of become something else, or it may become not as useful. It may be that it should be term limited in some way, and that the concept kind of plays itself out and then yields to essentially state and federal actions independent of an independent transmission monitor.
Commissioner Duffley, then Chair Nelson, then we're moving on.
I just wanted to point out an observation that no one has discussed the potential is this legal? Do you have the legal background or the legal support, the law that to create this ITM? That was brought up multiple times at the technical conference, and it has not been discussed today. So I just wanted to make it part of the record.
I'll discuss it in due course.
I thought that was going to be your third thing. Okay. Chair Nelson.
And just very quickly, I do agree that the state commissions have a role in doing this, but I also think that we are generally talking about interstate transmission lines, and we're dealing with areas like offshore wind, where you've got New York ISO, the New England ISO, and PJM all building lines to a central area of where generation is being helped from. And I think that's beyond the capabilities to some degree of individual state commissions. And there is a requirement that we have some oversight, or at least some a process for figuring out those rules. So it's certainly everyone has more to do here, but I think there is a federal role here for sure.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to move on to the formula rate part of our conversation. And the question is, what reforms, if any, to FERC's formula rate and or prudence frameworks are needed to adequately protect consumers, especially where local or regional transmission projects may not have been subject to robust state need and or prudence review? And we were going to have some comments first from Commissioner Christie, then Commissioner Clements, and then we're going to open it up.
Okay. Well, as someone who sat on many rate cases that were fully litigated, I think that our duty to produce just and reasonable rates, formula rates, leave a lot to be desired, that whole mechanism. But that's not in front of us right now. But in the context of transmission, I think what is in front of us is, again, when a transmission project comes to FERC and says, hey, we want formula rates, and they do, because what rational transmission owner wouldn't? What FERC controls is whether we give formula rate treatment. And so at least for this slice of the issue, not addressing the bigger issue about whether formula rates produce JNR rates at all, but at least for this slice of the issue, again, FERC cannot, should not be telling states how you should structure your CPCN processes, even what acronym you ought to use. But FERC can darn sure decide whether the project itself that comes gets formula rate treatment. FERC can absolutely do that. And I think that's the issue that is very much a realistic issue, because it creates an incentive for the transmission owners to go back to the states if they don't get it and say, hey, we need to help you guys get some resources. We need to help you guys get some authority, because otherwise we're not going to get formula rate treatment at FERC, and we really want it. So let's see if we can't get the legislature to get some more authority that you need and some more resources. So it changes the dynamic about, back home. So that, I think, is the efficacy of a proposal for FERC to look at what projects do we give formula rate treatment to and which ones do we not.
And do you have, I know you've brought this up at the technical session, do you have thoughts about how you would delineate?
Yes.
Did you want to share some?
Well, I don't know. I'm gonna ask Matt, should I do that yet, or?
It's you. You're allowed to.
Well, I don't want to jinx it by. Well, there's a lot of, within the framework of FERC decides who gets formula rates and who doesn't. And when I say who, I mean which transmission project. The question is, well, how do you know whether the state has a credible proposal? And I think the best place to start is to ask you, the individual state commissions, to certify whether you have a credible process or not, and gives you the opportunity to say, no, we don't. Or yes, we do. And FERC could potentially take that as self-proving if it came from you. That's one idea. And that'd be easy for FERC, because we just let you certify whether or not, let you attest whether you have a credible proceeding. And or if you don't, what do you need to get it? So that'd be the easiest for FERC, is just let you attest to it. You meeting the individual state commissions.
Good, thank you. Commissioner Clements.
This is really interesting, and I like all five of us being in the same room as the FERC commission, because we can deliberate in the open. And it's interesting to hear Commissioner Danley say that, what we should be doing is getting back into our rate-making responsibilities. And that is what this question is the heart of that. At the commission, I haven't been part of the evolution of formulate process, but this presumption of prudence, I was as much a practical need to address the fact that you can't review every single project specifically. That is hard. Like I said, the Office of Rate Litigation, they have, imagine trying to review the prudence of every project. I mean, and so have we gotten too far away from that? And has it made it more difficult for people who want to challenge the prudence of projects to get in there and make the case? To me, what the ITM isn't an end into itself. It's a kind of a practical solution to the reality that none of us have all of the resources to litigate every case. And I think, Chair French, your comment about wanting to take a lighter touch. So yeah, we could call, I appreciate Commissioner Christie's perspective on this one, and you could call up the PJM witness or the SPP witness or whoever. That's going to be a really busy person relative to the challenge at hand. And so there's no necessarily right answer. And to me, the fact that we've gotten to this place on how we deal with prudence at the commission, we need a practical solution to that. These are FERC jurisdictional rates. This is the bread and butter of what our commission is responsible for. So to say, and I guess that is why I feel very focused on moving forward in this conversation. Thanks.
Well, let's open it up. What do people think our formula rates need of reform, and what do you think about Commissioner Christie's approach. Do you have other ideas for other reforms that would be helpful? Chair French.
Thanks. I think I'll touch on several things that both the commissioners spoke about. I will start out by saying in Kansas, we pretty much have traditional rate-based rate of return based on a historical test year, and we think that's great. We think there's a lot of natural, cost containment incentives to having a little bit of regulatory lag in the process. We think we set really reasonable ROEs, even though they look a little different than a FERC ROE. I'm really sympathetic and probably agree 100% with the concern that Commissioner Danley has, that is the ITM just another abstraction that's going to get FERC away from actually setting just and reasonable rates, that examining these the way a state like Kansas does. I mean, I would love it if you guys wanted to undertake hundreds, if not thousands of rate cases over the next few years. But then to Commissioner Clement's point, it's just not the reality. It's not going to happen. It's not possible to have stated rates for every single utility. So, as much frustration as I have with formula rates and the formula rate process and what goes into it, I think you are left with that to some degree. But what I would say we find most vexing in Kansas is not the fact that FERC has formula rates. It is more the incongruity of the economic signals that are sent by the formula rates and some of what is input into them versus the economic signals that a stated rate in a state like Kansas might give. And the fact that those are going to cause utilities, and it's not their fault, but it will cause them to value investments differently. They are going to move capital toward local transmission planning because it's not going to receive as much scrutiny. It's not going to have any regulatory lag. And quite frankly, it's going to get higher return, whether that's justified or not. And I'm not here to tell you that they shouldn't be spending on that issue. But what I am here to tell you is that what we would like them to do is at least value different types of investments the same. We would like them to value local transmission planning the same as the option of building generation. We'd like them to value it the same as building a non-transmission alternative or grid enhancing technologies. And I think that the incongruity between these rate treatments is what I view as the real problem. And let me just throw out one, crazy idea. There's probably other ways to get there. We're sitting in a joint state federal proceeding right now under 209B, the Federal Power Act. Is there a possibility to establish some sort of joint board between FERC and the states to look at ways to harmonize our rate making treatments to make sure that transmission owners, utilities value investments similarly across, that they don't have these perverse incentives to funnel money into one particular type of investment simply because of the type of rate treatment that it gets. So it's a thought, but I identify that the biggest problem with transmission formula rates is just the incongruity that they provide to the types of investments.
So as we go forward, so you named three kinds of incongruity: less scrutiny, no regulatory lag, and a higher return on equity. So how do you fix those problems? So let's keep going. Chair Nelson.
I think that those are obviously differences. And when I think about pushing the ideas back down to the states, it does, I think Commissioner Christie was careful, right? And he's making a proposal here. Certification, I think we want to find out what that meant, but it sounds like individual states will have a process that they would look at to say whether or not a transmission project can move forward. But it sounds like, and then if that was a thumbs up, it would be eligible to go into formula rates. I think that the problem there is usually in those types of proceedings, you get differences. And I want to make sure that we keep in mind that states themselves are everyone is, right? Every FERC's resource constrained, ISOs, regional ISOs are resource constraints, states are resource constrained. So I think that the formula rates are a reality of making progress in a way that is kind of the best we can do and right now. And I think we should look to improve that. But I just want to make sure that we're not going to start to schism how that's being done into regions or individually between states. Like if a line's being built from Vermont to Massachusetts, do Riley and I have to agree on what the ROE of that line is, or is there, what is that process? So I have lots of questions there. And I think that that's worthy of more discussion. And so I think the idea that we have an ongoing conversation, or we have some sort of joint board that looks into those issues to improve rate making would be a worthwhile suggestion, because I think we can get there and we can do something that's going to make sure FERC feels good about the projects coming up and that they have state support, which is what I hear you saying, Commissioner Christie, but also that the states aren't being asked to do everything. Because I do think that we sometimes get into things not at the beginning, but in the middle. And that might not be the best time to say, yeah, this is the perfect project, yes or no, because there's still a lot of things that happen after. And there's a lot of stuff that happened before that we didn't really have a sense of.
Commissioner Christie.
Let me just clarify.
Yeah,
Commissioner Nelson, what I put out there as an idea
yeah,
is simply if a project is, let's say it's a local project.
Yep.
Not even crossing the state line. So you don't have to ask Riley. Okay. Let's say it's a local project in Massachusetts and they come and the TO comes from formula rate treatment. And we simply grant it or not, asking you in Massachusetts Commission, do you have a credible system? And the answer is yes or no. So it doesn't take a lot of staff time to do that. That's all I'm proposing. If it is a regional project and it's 2 states, then we could ask you and Raleigh both, yes or no. Do you have a credible process? So it's not a lot of staff time. Let me just make that clear. It's just asking you to tell us yes or no. Do you have a credible process based on some basic criteria? So, I mean, God, I've heard this all day long. Oh, we don't have the resources. We don't have the time. I mean, we're not asking you to do, I'm not proposing that you do a whole lot. Simply tell us, do you have a credible system? Tell us yes or no, and then we'll make the decision whether to give formula rates or not. And I'm not proposing to do away with formula rates either. Of course, there's a practical reason we have formula rates. But this is on transmission and whether these projects, which are now going up over 9% a year and going into people's bills, are going to get some scrutiny. And we need you at the state level to provide that scrutiny. And if you don't have the authority, then go to your legislature and ask for it and tell us that we can give them formula rates or not. That's all I'm talking about.
Let's take 3 more and then we're going to need to move on because we have another bucket that we want to cover. Chair Pridemore and then Commissioner Clements and Commissioner Allen.
Following on Commissioner Christie's idea, that credible process, is it possible to do an annual review of a credible process to where a state can verify to the FERC and say, look, this is our credible process. Does it, pass or fail?
Yes. If your legislature changes the law, you change your certificate.
Commissioner Clements.
Thanks. I meant to say this at the start of my last response, which is that I'm open to continuing this conversation on Commissioner Christie's approach. And one question I have, I don't like this idea of whether it's a joint board or, a joint board that then has support through staff, consultants, whatever we need to have the conversation. One question to me is what happens if we deny that treatment, right? Does the project not happen, or is it a stated rate relative that, do we go through that process at the commission? And I don't understand the stated rate process enough to know how that would play out, but I would just throw that into the mix for things to talk about.
Mr. Allen.
Well, I just wanted to lend some support for Commissioner Christie's proposal. I think it's interesting, and I think it's putting it to the states, and I think that's the right direction rather than FERC somehow trying to make a call on its own to kind of triage on, to create a process or framework for evaluating whether states have adequate planning processes or certification processes, putting it to the states to make that judgment and make a recommendation to FERC. Ultimately, the responsibility needs to stay with FERC on their actions. It's their responsibility to determine just and reasonable rates. But yeah, and obviously I'm speaking for myself with everything I say, not on behalf of my commission.
So we're going to move on to two other potential parts of a solution that that folks wanted to discuss. And so the two questions are, where RTO or non-RTO planning regions do not address the needs identified, are there reforms to existing rules that could otherwise address the concerns like increased transparency, reviewing additional projects in a FERC jurisdictional process? And secondly, should the relative risk of transmission projects, such as projects that do not encounter state review, be considered when reviewing ROE and incentives? And we're going to start with New England heavy, Chair Nelson, Commissioner Allen, and then Commissioner Clements, and then we'll hear from others.
And folks to jump in as the vertically integrated area. We may not be the best spokesperson for this. I've always had a lot of respect for what happens in PJM and MISO and other areas of the country and how much they go into it. I'll start by just saying I think the economic incentives that are put out there are always need to be reviewed and looked at, right? I think Chair French talked a lot about, traditional cost of service rate making, regulatory lag. I think Commissioner Christie is on the money that formula rates should be a benefit, right? It's a carrot that should not be a given, right? And I think that type of incentive makes a lot of sense. So when we think about how to structure things, right, there's two problems where I see costs really getting out of line. Once you've determined that you need a transmission project, whether it's for reliability, in New England, we would love to build it for economic reasons based on where our prices are going. I would say that there's issues on the front end and there's issues on the back end. On the front end in New England, and I'll speak for this, we've pushed ISO to look at a longer term planning horizon. They've done so. We've asked them to put out competitive bids versus just, doing kind of patchwork reliability projects that are shorter term. That one example of the competitive process, I think you saw a lot of creative bids. You got a project that we thought was going to be 10, 20x the price. When the competitive process started, you got a project that was much smaller, which is a benefit to customers, right? And so the final price of that was much lower than what we expected. That competitive process and a lot of people competing in an open market to try to get to build that line seem to be fairly effective at giving you initial cost. But then the second thing that we often see is the back end, right? Which is transmission is hard, right? Building it is hard and oftentimes is needed and it's wanted, but you see a lot of cost overruns. And I think that there could be a lot of attention paid to ways to incentivize minimizing cost overruns. We talked a little bit about the 25% before, where, if it goes over 25%, maybe you look at it again. But I think that you also have to say, if you've sunk in a lot of money on this and you've already cited it and got the lines, there is a point where it's very difficult to say, oh, too much, this project's too much, let's stop it. So, I mean, my suggestion, which is kind of out of the box, is to think about ROE, right? Because I think ROE is something that utilities pay a lot of attention to. If you just have a flat ROE and the budget keeps going up, that sends an economic signal to the company that no matter what, this is the return I'm getting. I think thinking about step down ROEs, where your ROE is a certain number, and then as that project cost rises, that goes down, will change the way that the companies look at these capital investments, because they'll say, cost overruns at a certain point, I'll be better off moving on to another project and investing my capital there. So let's get a good bid and let's stay on budget and stay on time here, because we're not going to make as much money if this project goes over. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, even in a formula rate structure, to improve the economic incentives to the companies to bring benefits to consumers by tapering or controlling some of those costs.
Mr. Allen.
There are a couple things that come to mind that fall into kind of the other potential solutions category. And I'll just kind of share the fact that I think it was the Harvard Electricity Law Initiative that put together, I think, a relatively robust list of kind of other things that can kind of be put forward. I'll just highlight a few of them that I find interesting. A differential ROE for projects that are local or self-approved, lower risk, recognizing that there is indeed perhaps a lower risk attached to certain categories of projects, and it might help to offset essentially the bias that seems to be present in some region towards self-approved project. I think that's an interesting proposal and should be considered. The joint board concept, I think, is interesting, but it's really a question of what the details. What is the scope of responsibility of a joint board? But I think that should be explored. I think laying out criteria for investments that should be subject to some sort of a cost sharing or cost cap or cost variance process, ensuring that that's kind of hardwired into the process in individual regions, recognizing that there should probably be flexibility among the states and the regions for such a mechanism. But I do think that cost overruns are a persistent issue, and more should be done there. And then I think, continuing to take a hard look at the opportunities for infusing competition into transmission projects where it makes sense. So providing, good direction around the opportunities for competition out there. That's all.
Commissioner Clements.
I'm really glad we had this on the agenda for this task force meeting. I thought it might be repetitive to the technical conference, but it's really evolving the conversation. So I appreciate all of the input and thought that went into this. I'll just throw a few things. I think, all tools should be, our toolbox should be on the table before we commit to any one of these steps. And so I'll just add a few more to what Commissioner Allen added into the hopper. This idea of an information repository, it may not have to be, to Chair Pridemore's point and to Chair French's point, at an ITM. It could live at the commission, and there could be some sort of standardized FERC Form 1-esque filing requirement that helps to get apples to apples metrics for people to use. That's interesting. Minimum transparency requirements. Transparency is good. It's hard to enforce. And if we look to 890 and say, are all these processes really standing up to the expectation or, the intent of that requirement? Is there anything else we need to do on that front to ensure minimum transparency relative to all these planning processes? This variance analysis is interesting. And I think there's a lot more conversation to have about what we do after the projects get chosen, because that's a different role. And you're getting into reviewing EPC contracts and prices and things that aren't necessarily a nice, easy fit at the FERC, not necessarily at the regional level. And then we haven't talked about local planning criteria and how that relates to cost minimums and differential ROEs and the awarding of formula rates. So that's something that would be potentially important to have on the table. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So any comments on what you just heard from Chair Nelson and Commissioners Allen and Clements, or any parting thoughts on our kind of rush through this today? I know we didn't tie neat bows around things today, but I think it was an important conversation, hopefully helpful to everybody as we move forward in this area. So I'm going to turn it back over to the co-chairs for some parting thoughts and end on time. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. I didn't think a 2.5 hour meeting would be like a lightning round, but compared to our 5-hour meetings, it has been. So I won't summarize the thoughts. I think everybody made very clear remarks today. I have to say, over the past year, folks have approached me and said, what is the product of this joint board? Will it be a white paper or some type of report? And I think as we saw today, the product is our coming together of ideas. As Commissioner Clements stated, it's good for us all to be at the table. I'd reflect that this is the first of the 5 task force meetings where we're all actually in the same room together and nobody's participating virtually. And I think that has helped inform this dialogue. Well, there are plenty of other issues to tackle. A lot of the issues today were not necessarily resolved, but we heard different ideas, different perspectives. It's an issue that has perplexed us for at least 6 years. And Commissioner Christie, I'll figure out what happened to that, that pleading. But I'll look forward to continuing this very important conversation with my state colleagues and my FERC colleagues as well.
Thank you, Chair Stanek. First of all, I agree completely with what Commissioner Clement said, which is that we did, this conversation was very additive to what we discussed at the technical conference. It's been very helpful. And I think it's going to very much help solidify where the commission might head on this particular issue, and hopefully you all at the state level as well. Couple things, one of which is that I think that it's very likely that we'll have the next meeting of this task force in February at the NARUC meetings in Washington, DC. The subject matter obviously will be determined at a later date. In case I'm not back in February, we'll see if I am or not. But if not, just wanted to thank everybody. First of all, thank the staff that worked so hard on this. Morris Schreim from the Maryland Public Service Commission, Jennifer Murphy from NARUC, and of course, Liz Salerno, who I think her real title was guru at a transmission or something like that at FERC. But all 3 of them have been really amazing in putting this all together. And wanted to thank President Shalander, is no longer with the Idaho Commission and no longer with NARUC, but we sat down a while ago to talk about this and think about what we should do. And I think this has far exceeded my expectations, the discussions we've had and the products that come out of it. And so much want to thank Chair Stanek for doing a great job chairing the N10, and for you all. I know you put a lot of work into this, all the state regulators. I know there's a lot of pre-meetings, and Chair Chandler was one of the pre-meeting people earlier, but it's really been extremely helpful. From FERC perspective, we really, except for these public meetings, we can't actually meet together. So it's very helpful to have the discussion. So again, I just want to thank you all. And thank you again, Chair Stanek, for your leadership.
Chair Glick, thank you. And hopefully this isn't the last time we see you at this table, but we appreciate your leadership. I recall that back in January of 2021 on Inauguration Day, we the states issued an open letter to FERC, and you heard our call loud and clear. And I give you a tremendous amount of credit for using Section 209B to convene this body.
Thank you very much. Just want to lastly thank you, Dr. Rob, too, for your moderation. It's been very helpful.
Thank you. So we are adjourned, and we'll hopefully see everybody in February.